The name Genghis Khan echoes through history, conjuring images of a warrior, a unifier, a titan of conquest. He is the man who welded the disparate Mongol tribes into a single, unstoppable force, building the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever known, a domain that stretched from the shores of the Pacific to the heart of Europe. He is remembered, often with a sense of awe, as a peerless military strategist, a surprisingly progressive lawmaker, and a visionary who connected East and West. His legacy is one of power, of order, and of a world forever changed by his ambition. But this is only half the story. Behind the gleaming facade of legend, beneath the tales of glory and imperial grandeur, lies a truth far more terrifying. It is a story written in blood and fear, a history that is seldom told in its full, gut-wrenching detail. The rise of the great Mongol Empire was not merely a product of brilliant strategy or charismatic leadership. It was an edifice built upon a foundation of unimaginable cruelty, a regime fueled by fear, and constructed on the broken backs and shattered spirits of millions who were captured, silenced, and systematically dehumanized. In this exploration, we will strip away the myths to confront the harrowing reality of Genghis Khan's rule. We will uncover the shocking, methodical brutality he inflicted upon those he deemed slaves. This is a journey into the darkest aspects of his empire, from the chillingly practical use of human beings as living shields in the heat of battle, to the orchestration of mass psychological torment designed to break the soul, and the systemic sexual exploitation so vast its genetic footprint remains imprinted on humanity to this day. This is the side of history that the grand narratives of conquest often bury. Genghis Khan undeniably reshaped the world, but he did so by carving deep, indelible scars into its lands, its people, and its collective memory. This is not just the story of a conqueror, it is the story of those he conquered. And it is time their voices, long silenced, are finally heard. Let us begin with one of the most viscerally horrifying tactics in the Mongol arsenal, a strategy that reveals the cold, pragmatic cruelty at the heart of Genghis Khan's military doctrine, the use of human beings as literal shields. This was not a desperate measure taken in a moment of crisis, it was a calculated, frequently deployed strategy. Imagine the scene. As the Mongol hordes advanced on a fortified city, they did not lead with their elite warriors. Instead, they drove thousands of captives before them, men, women, and sometimes even children, stripped of any hope and forced into the front lines. These unfortunate souls became a living, breathing wall of flesh, a disposable armor destined to absorb the first deadly volleys of enemy arrows, spears, and stones. Their bodies were the price paid to protect the valuable Mongol soldiers marching safely behind them. This tactic served a dual purpose. On a purely military level, it was brutally effective, minimizing Mongol casualties and preserving the strength of Khan's army for the final assault. But its psychological impact was perhaps even more significant. It sent a chilling, unambiguous message to his adversaries: resistance will not just lead to your death, it will be a spectacle of unimaginable horror. You will not be fighting soldiers, you will be forced to slaughter the very people you may have once called neighbors, friends, or countrymen. One of the most infamous documented uses of this strategy occurred during the invasion of the Western Xia Kingdom in 1209. Facing the formidable Tangut defenses, Genghis Khan reportedly forced some 30,000 captured Chinese soldiers to march forward. They carried no weapons and wore no armor. Their only role was to die, to soak the earth with their blood so that the Khan's forces could advance with minimal risk. This barbarity was not an isolated incident. Years later, during the devastating campaign against the Khwarezmian Empire in Central Asia, the tactic was repeated, but with an even more grotesque flourish. There, thousands of captured Muslim prisoners were not only marched to their deaths but were sometimes bound together with ropes, ensuring none could flee their fate. In an even more terrifying display of psychological warfare, some captives were tied to Mongol catapults and hurled over the walls of besieged cities, human projectiles used to spread terror and despair within the fortifications. It is difficult to comprehend the sheer nihilism of such an act. For Genghis Khan, however, this was more than just warfare, it was a performance of absolute dominance, a way to conquer not only the battlefield but the very minds and souls of those who dared to oppose him. For the enslaved who survived the initial onslaught, life was not a gift of mercy but an extension of the horror. Those not immediately sacrificed in battle were subjected to a different kind of slow death, a life of backbreaking labor and soul-crushing humiliation. Captives were forced into immense, life-shortening construction projects. With their bare hands, they dug massive canals, hauled colossal stones to pave roads across the vast steppes, and carried unbearable loads for the Mongol war machine across treacherous terrain. This was not merely about building infrastructure, it was a ritual of subjugation. It was the ultimate symbol of domination, forcing the conquered to physically construct the empire that had utterly crushed them. But their utility did not end with labor. Genghis Khan also used his captives for grotesque entertainment, turning human life into a public spectacle for the amusement of himself and his court. These were not simple displays of skill, they were carefully orchestrated performances of violence and degradation. In some instances, enslaved people were forced to fight one another to the death in gladiatorial combat, a brutal parody of warrior honor. In other, even more horrific cases, they were thrown into pits with starved, wild animals, to be torn apart limb from limb while their captors watched and reveled in the carnage. The message, broadcast through these acts of depravity, was brutally clear: your life has no value. You are an object, a plaything, existing only for our amusement. This was not cruelty for its own sake, it was a calculated instrument of control. By systematically dehumanizing these people, the Mongols reinforced their own absolute power, making rebellion seem not only futile but conceptually impossible. The more broken the slave, the more secure the master. Yet, as horrifying as these public displays of physical and psychological torment were, there was another layer to the cruelty of the Mongol Empire, one that was perhaps even more profound, personal, and devastating in its long-term consequences. We now turn to the subject of systemic sexual exploitation, a chapter of this history not often highlighted in textbooks but one that is essential to understanding the true nature of Genghis Khan's power. Behind the grand maps of conquered territories and the annals of military victories, there lies a darker, more intimate map of conquest, written not on land, but on the bodies of tens of thousands of women. It is well documented that Genghis Khan had a vast number of wives and concubines, with historical records and oral traditions suggesting a figure in the hundreds, if not thousands. It is crucial to understand that these were not romantic or consensual unions. They were calculated acts of possession, the ultimate spoils of war. When the Mongol army descended upon a new territory, they did not just seize the land, the livestock, and the treasure. They seized the people. Women, in particular, were viewed as a primary form of war booty. Regardless of their age, social standing, or religious beliefs, they were captured, categorized, and distributed among the victors. The most beautiful or high-ranking women were often presented directly to the Khan himself, while others were given as rewards to his sons, his most loyal generals, and his soldiers. This was not a chaotic frenzy of violence, it was a highly organized system of human trafficking, woven directly into the fabric of the Mongol military machine. To Genghis Khan, women were more than just prizes, they were a form of currency and a potent political tool. There are numerous accounts of him using enslaved women as diplomatic gifts to reward allies or as bargaining chips to seal treaties. The daughters of defeated kings, the young women of noble families, and countless peasant women were handed over like livestock, their bodies becoming instruments of diplomacy and living trophies of conquest. It became standard practice for a general, upon conquering a new city, to select the most desirable female captives and present them to the Khan as a tribute. For these women, their fate was sealed. They were destined for the Khan's harem, to serve as concubines, or to be strategically married off to solidify political alliances. One of the most historically significant examples of this practice involved a captured princess from the Tangut kingdom. After conquering the western Xia, Genghis Khan took this young royal as one of his consorts. She would later give birth to a son who, ironically, would become one of the most famous rulers in history, Kublai Khan, the future founder of the Yuan dynasty in China. Think of the staggering implication of this fact. The very building blocks of one of history's great empires, the genealogies that shaped the future of Asia, were founded upon acts of sexual exploitation and the brutal subjugation of a captured woman. Genghis Khan's sexual dominance was not confined to his own harem. He explicitly granted his generals and soldiers permission to take women from the territories they overran. This policy normalized and institutionalized mass sexual assault, creating a culture of abuse where the trauma of conquest extended far beyond the battlefield and into the most personal aspects of life. The long-term legacy of this systemic violation is nothing short of astonishing, leaving an imprint that is not merely cultural or political, but genetic. In 2003, a landmark study published by a team of geneticists revealed a startling discovery. They found that a specific Y chromosome lineage is present in an extraordinarily high percentage of men across a vast swath of Asia, the heartland of the former Mongol Empire. Today, nearly 1 in every 200 men alive, a staggering total of around 16 million people, carries genetic markers that trace back to a single common male ancestor who lived in Mongolia approximately 800 years ago. The historical and genetic evidence points overwhelmingly to one man, Genghis Khan himself. Let the scale of that sink in. His genetic footprint is scattered across a massive portion of the modern human population, not as a result of peaceful migration or cultural exchange, but as a direct consequence of a systematic and violent sexual dominance over generations of women. This revelation forces us to rethink the very concept of a legacy. The empire's map is written not just in territory, but in bloodlines. For the countless women subjected to this violence, their own stories were almost completely erased. Their names are forgotten, their suffering undocumented, their individual tragedies swallowed by the grand narrative of empire. They exist now only as ghosts in the chronicles, mentioned, if at all, as the mothers of future rulers or as faceless figures in someone else's tale of glory. But their experiences matter profoundly, for they reveal a brutal truth about the nature of absolute power. They show us how conquest does not stop at city gates, it invades homes, it violates bodies, and it leaves scars that echo through the DNA of generations. Women were bartered like cattle, used as dowries, offered as bribes, and, once their perceived usefulness was over, often discarded, given away to lesser commanders, or relegated to the role of servants within the sprawling palace system. And yet, in the strange and brutal paradox of empire, the very structures that dehumanized them also, on occasion, opened up bizarre corridors of influence. Some of these women, through their powerful children or through their own political acumen behind the scenes, managed to play pivotal roles in Mongol court life. But this influence was always conditional, always existing under the immense and unyielding shadow of absolute male domination. Genghis Khan's relationship with women was never personal, it was political, symbolic, and violently strategic, reflecting the broader cruelty of a regime where nothing was off-limits and no act was too horrific if it served to maintain and expand his control. And this brings us to the great, haunting paradox of Genghis Khan. How do we balance the historical record of his staggering achievements with the undeniable horror of his methods? Because to dismiss him as a simple, barbaric warlord is to miss the complexity of his impact. The man who ordered mass executions and razed entire cities to the ground was, simultaneously, a brilliant strategist, a revolutionary lawmaker, and a unifier of unprecedented scale. His empire was not just forged in blood and fire, it was also built with a sophisticated and often surprisingly progressive vision. After his death in 1227, the Mongol Empire did not collapse as many do. It continued to expand, a testament to the powerful systems he had put in place. His descendants, many of them born from the very exploitation we have just detailed, carried his legacy of conquest across Asia and into Europe. The empire fractured into powerful successor states, the Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Great Yuan dynasty in China, founded by his grandson Kublai Khan. And in each of these domains, the core philosophy endured, absolute authority maintained through disciplined violence and the strategic use of terror. The practice of making examples of cities that resisted became official policy. Massacres were not hidden acts of shame, they were advertised. Stories of entire populations being systematically exterminated, of rivers literally running red with blood, of macabre pyramids of human skulls erected at the gates of ruined cities. These were not just rumors, they were calculated warnings broadcast to the world. And they were brutally effective. Hearing of the fate that befell great centers of civilization like Nishapur, Merv, or Samarkand, many neighboring kingdoms chose to surrender without a fight. Genghis Khan had created a psychological empire, one where fear traveled much faster than his armies ever could. Yet, alongside this reign of terror, Khan introduced reforms that were centuries ahead of their time. He established a complex legal code known as the Yasa, which, while harsh, created a unified set of laws for the entire empire. It demanded absolute loyalty and punished theft and betrayal with death, but it also included provisions that protected trade caravans and granted tax exemptions to the leaders of all religions. He completely dismantled the old system of aristocratic privilege within his ranks. Under his rule, promotion was based on merit and skill, not on bloodline. If you were talented and loyal, you could rise to the highest positions, a concept of meritocracy that was virtually unheard of in the feudal societies of the 13th century. Furthermore, in an age of brutal religious warfare, Genghis Khan was remarkably tolerant. He offered his protection to Buddhists, Christians, Muslims, and other faiths within his empire, allowing them to practice freely so long as they submitted to his authority and prayed for his success. He understood that managing a diverse empire depended on stability, not forced conversion, and some of his closest and most trusted advisors came from completely different cultures and faiths. The brutal conqueror who drowned cities in blood was also the man who stabilized the trade routes that became the legendary Silk Road, creating a period of peace known as the Pax Mongolica. Under the rule of his heirs, goods, technologies, and ideas flowed between East and West as never before. Gunpowder made its way from China to the Middle East, Persian astronomy deeply influenced Chinese scholars, and European travelers like Marco Polo could journey across a continent secured by Mongol power. But we must never forget that this progress was paid for in blood. The Mongol system functioned because it was built on a foundation of fear, exploitation, and the systematic enslavement of human beings. Slavery was not an unfortunate byproduct of war, it was official state policy. Skilled artisans, engineers, scribes, and even physicians were rounded up from conquered lands and forced to work for the Mongol state, becoming property of the empire. They were stripped of their identity and reduced to their function, efficient tools for a ruthlessly efficient regime. The cost of this system was the utter destruction of entire cultures. Languages disappeared, belief systems vanished, and whole populations were erased from the pages of history, many never to recover. This brings us to the final, fascinating contradiction. In Mongolia today, Genghis Khan is not seen as a villain. He is revered as a national hero, the father of the nation. His face is on their money, the international airport bears his name, and colossal statues of him dominate the landscape, gazing out over the steppe. He is remembered not for the horror, but for the pride, the unity, and the greatness he brought to a people who were once scattered and powerless. It is a potent reminder that history is always a matter of perspective. For the people of Persia, Russia, and China, he was a nightmare made flesh, a harbinger of the apocalypse. For the Mongols, he was the man who gave them a name, a place in the world, and an empire. For us, looking back across the centuries, he must be both, the visionary who connected continents and the warlord who drowned them in blood, the emperor whose genetic legacy may live inside millions of us, and the tyrant whose cruelty knew no bounds. So, what do we do with a legacy so vast and so stained? Perhaps the only answer is to remember it in its entirety. We must acknowledge not just the genius and the glory, but the broken lives and the unimaginable suffering left in his wake. We must remember the slaves who had no voice, the women who had no choice, and the cultures that were given no chance to survive. To study Genghis Khan is not just to learn about the past. It is to hold a mirror to humanity itself, to reflect on the terrifying cost of power, the limits of ambition, and the chilling reality that greatness and monstrosity can, and often do, walk hand in hand.